Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
Sometimes the best way to find a living is to stay right where you are and study with UAS online. Career-specific distance programs from the University of Alaska Southeast are the fastest way to increase your earning power.
We connect all over the world.
The National Weather Service.
And good Tuesday evening, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service here in Alaska. It is the 19th of July. As always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your local weather service information for all of Alaska, no matter what part. You can reach us at weather.gov/Alaska or weather.gov/Fairbanks/Anchorage or /Juneau. Call us on the weather info line at 800-472-0391. And if you've got a question about the new websites that you're seeing, if you need to figure out where the climate data is, if you'd like to know where your river forecast information is, or how about the fire weather situation, you can email us at nws.ar.tvweather@noaa.gov, and that'll come to yours truly. I'll be happy to help you find the information you're looking for online or on social media. Here's a look at the hazardous weather situation across Alaska now. Let's start in South Central with the McHugh Creek fire, of course. That has a lot of attention along the Seward Highway, not to mention air quality. If you're in the general vicinity, especially downwind, and that could be into the Seward area, air quality could be worsening in your area. So keep that in mind if you're starting to have a little trouble breathing. That could be one of the reasons why, thanks to that particulate and the smoke coming from northwest to south and east. It is not moving toward Anchorage. It is moving away from Anchorage and across the Kenai Peninsula at this point. Another thing to keep in mind is travel conditions there. If you are trying to get down the Seward Highway, chances are you're going to have some trouble there. Restrictions have been in place, and again, check in with the Alaska DOT and the very latest on any road closures due to the fire right next to the road along the Seward Highway. Again, that could be impacting travel. Fire danger is highlighted here for the Anchorage borough as well as parts of the western Kenai Peninsula, generally through the Potter Valley area there, the Portage Valley, I should say. High fire danger is expected to continue through the rest of tonight, and we'll continue to see kind of high fire danger as we go through tomorrow, but changes are coming as we get into Thursday and Friday with wetter weather and cooler and cloudier weather as well. So perhaps we'll catch a break toward the end of the week. As you look up to the north, Fairbanks is under a flood watch right now. A lot of rain here in the last several days, and again, flooding concerns there. That will continue to be an issue as we go into the next 24 hours or more. So a flood watch is posted for that general vicinity. And the winter storm warning continues at least until noon tomorrow for the northeastern slopes of the Brooks Range and the eastern side east of the Dalton Highway. Could see a total of 4 to 8 inches there above 3,500 feet. So no, not the end of summer just yet. It is a little bit of a cooler and wetter pattern at elevation, and not for the rest of us. But again, if you're heading northward, especially east of the Dalton Highway, expect to encounter a little more snow. That worst of it will come in tonight and early tomorrow morning. Fire danger, obviously. We are in the thick of it right now across South Central and once again across the Copper Basin. Higher than normal fire danger levels right now for parts of the lower terrain as well as parts of the middle to upper Yukon Valley around Fort Yukon and points west, and also in the coastal areas of the Kotzebue Sound region around Kotzebue itself upward toward Kivalina and into southwestern Alaska. Like I said, though, changes are coming as we get into tomorrow night and into Thursday with rain moving in from southwest, and then that will spread eastward with time. And southeast also looking at some elevated fire danger around the Juneau area due to the drier than normal conditions for you lately. Changes are coming for you as early as tonight and tomorrow. Here's a look at the visible satellite picture, and you can see dry weather over southeast, but look at the dry swath here across a large chunk of the central and northwestern Gulf of Alaska. Clouds are moving eastward. Another disturbance pushing eastward will help to inspire more rainfall for southeast as we get into tomorrow and especially Thursday. Across the interior, plenty of clouds, a lot of that convection though, the upward moving air, showers and thunderstorms forming across the upper Yukon Valley and moving from west to east now instead of that east to westerly flow that we had a couple weeks ago that was really inspiring a great deal of showers and thunderstorms. Now as you look out across southwestern Alaska, we have plenty of clouds, but also dry weather for southwest and Bristol Bay. Plenty of clouds across the central and eastern chain as well, and new weather systems moving in from the North Pacific, and you can see that swirl of clouds moving into the western Bering over the last 24 hours there. The main weather player though is this super highway of weather dipping down into Alaska. That northwest to easterly flow is moving weather and cooler air along with it. As soon as that meets up with this, the moisture and cooler weather will combine and we'll have a better chance for rain across more of southwest and south central Alaska. Here's a look at the weather map, and cooler air is poised and ready to move southward. We're not going to get a huge punch of that across southwest or south central or southeast, but it is cold enough to snow at higher elevations and across the Brooks Range once again. High pressure sitting across the Chukchi coast. That is also going to keep ice pushed up against Barrow for the next several days. Tonight's forecast keeps that front lingering very close to the Brooks Range summit. Some spotty showers across the higher terrain, but that's about it. Out across the west, look for that next weather maker to move eastward with warmer air working across the eastern chain as a ridge of high pressure slides out of the way. This front will move in across the Bering, pushing rainfall and clouds closer to the western coastline. Showers are possible across some of the higher terrain of southeast tonight. You'll have a better chance for some light rain to develop throughout the daytime tomorrow. You'll notice the cooler air up north does not budge southward, but the weather maker out west does, and this starts creeping eastward into Bristol Bay and approaches Kodiak Island in the Alaska Peninsula as we head through the afternoon tomorrow. By Thursday, a better chance for light rainfall across more parts of southwest, more parts of south central, the Susitna Valley, the Matanuska Valley, around Anchorage and around Kenai and around the McHugh Creek Fire. And into southeastern Alaska, we'll have a better chance for some light rainfall in more places across the Panhandle. And once again, that cooler air up north just doesn't budge because high pressure is still winning the day there. Here's a look at temperatures today across southeast, lower to mid 60s for many, a fairly mild and calm day, about 64 or so around Juneau, Haines and Skagway, also in the lower 60s. Sitka closer to 59, lower to mid 60s for Ketchikan and Annette. Higher was 68. Prince William Sound temperatures scorching, lower to mid 60s, 70s in fact for many, 68 in Cordova, 82 in Seward, 76 in Kenai for everyone out there, and 64 in Homer. It was in the upper 70s around Anchorage, 71 for Talkeetna. Fairbanks saw 64, 65 in Eagle. And across the Arctic coast behind that cold front, 30s and 40s. Inland temperatures, of course, considerably milder, but Barrow was only 35, Kaktovik 34, Wainwright 37. Kotzebue saw temperatures back in the mid-60s today, 61 in Shishmaref and 52 in Nome, with Unalakleet in the mid-50s. Galena saw 62. South and western temperatures were generally in the 50s and 60s, with Bethel at 57, King Salmon and Dillingham right around 70 degrees. St. Paul, you had 53. Unalaska and Dutch Harbor closer to 70 today, and mid-50s around Adak and Atka with 49 at Shemya. South Central will see overnight lows in the lower to mid-50s. Another mild night in Kodiak at 58. Southeast in the mid-50s with low temperatures in the north at or even just above freezing north of the Brooks Range summits, 38 around Arctic Village. Bethel, you should expect a low near 50. St. Paul, about 52, with the Aleutians in the upper 40s to low 50s for most of the chain and the peninsula, and 48 in Nome with a high there tomorrow of 54. South Central's highs tomorrow back in the lower to mid 70s. Another mild day with high temps in southeast in the upper 50s and lower 60s. Fairbanks closer to 65, above freezing in Barrow, but still in the 30s with Prudhoe Bay and Dead Horse back in the mid 40s, 54 around Nome. Bethel again 64, 56 in St. Paul. Flying weather shows IFR conditions lingering across the Arctic coast throughout the daytime tomorrow and across the west, with poor visibility to start in some parts of Icy Cape and around Cape Fairweather, but watch for improvements as we get into the afternoon there. IFR will linger across the west coast from Wales and Tin City all the way down to Cape Newenham. Probably MVFR and Bethel through a good part of the day, and creeping into Kodiak as that frontal boundary approaches. Here's your pass conditions. Look for improvement for Anaktuvik and Adigan Pass tomorrow. Snow will gradually end from west to east. Look for Lake Clark and Merrill Pass to hold around MVFR throughout most of the day. We expect similar conditions in rainy and windy passes tomorrow. Isabel Pass, we expect to see MVFR developing throughout the day. Mentasta Pass looks to stay at visual flight rule through most of your day. Tanita Pass also appears to be visual, as well as Portage Pass, but watch for smoke there, and Chilcoot and White Pass, MVFR conditions there. The cooler air is moving eastward, but it is pushing freezing levels down to about 10 to 12,000 across southeast and across south central and across the north slope, 2, 4, even 6,000 foot freezing levels there across the Brooks Range summits, and out across the west. Temperatures are dropping as well across the western Bering Sea. Icing potential, though, really has levels in the threat pretty high up there. You have to get above 6,000 feet across the far eastern Beaufort Seacoast, and then above 13 to 16,000 feet across the middle Yukon Valley and the Koyukuk and Noatak valleys, and across the west coast and the Alaska Peninsula and the eastern chain above 16,000 feet. So again, that threat is way up there with the warm temperatures in place. Here's that superhighway of weather, the Arctic jet stream taking a nosedive across Alaska from northwest to south and east. Wind speeds picking up from 55 to 90 knots. That's encouraging the weather change, but remember, we have to have moisture with the cool temperatures, and that's coming in from the west. The moisture is moving across the North Pacific at 75 to 100 knots, still working over a ridge of high pressure that's trying to get out of the way. At 9,000 feet, you can see our ridge across southwestern Alaska and the eastern chain. Wind speeds coming into southwest at 25 to as strong as 45 knots across the chain, but we have the north and northwesterly winds across the north slope and the interior at 10 to 20 knots with more of a westerly flow as it moves away from Alaska, and very gentle and light winds coming onshore to the Panhandle at about 10 knots. At 9,000 feet, we have a little bit of a circulation here west of the Dixon entrance, about 10 to 25 knots around that low. Here's our high pressure ridge once again across southwestern Alaska. Low pressure sitting outside of Kotzebue Sound, and our gentle onshore flow across the Beaufort Seacoast into the interior at about 10 to 15 knots. Turbulence potential generally from Cook Inlet, Kachemak Bay through Shelikof Strait, Bristol Bay, and all the way out toward the central Aleutians. Thumps and bumps are possible, but they should be relatively minor and light below about 4,000 feet. That's a look at your aviation forecast. I'll be back with an update on your sea ice edge and your marine weather here in just a few minutes.
This is Captain Gary Gore, a 727 pilot for United Airlines with nearly 13,000 hours. In the late spring of 1984, he was involved in a very serious microburst wind shear encounter at Denver's Stapleton International Airport. This is how he remembers that day.
Well, that morning, as I was driving to the airport, I happened to notice the mountains to the west were starting to pick up some lenticular cloud formations. And later on in dispatch, as I was reviewing the weather forecast, they indeed had forecast virga to be forming in the area later on that afternoon. Also a possibility of wind shears in the Denver area. When I walked out to the aircraft, I noticed the area was developing quite a few virga clouds. And I checked with my engineer to see what weather was as reported by the ATIS information. He said they reported gusty winds in the area, predominantly out of the west, and they were using runway 35 left at Denver, which is over 10,000 foot runway. And we went ahead with a normal pushback, and as we taxied around the east end of the building, found about 18 aircraft in front of us waiting for departure. The ground control told us to stay with them and get in the line, and when it became our turn to move over to the run-up area, the south end of 35 left, that would be the time they'd switch us over to the departure tower frequency. I elected to use 5 degrees of flap for our takeoff and told them to plan for a normal leaper, and when we got out to the runway, we would decide whether or not we would use the maximum leaper if conditions required it. There was fairly darkening lower level clouds coming in, and we could see some virga further up towards the north and the northwest of the airport. Nothing around the actual airport vicinity. We spotted some dust blowing about midfield point on the runway, and we discussed that in some length, and all recalled that they were doing some dirt moving and construction in that area, and that it indicated that there was fairly good wind blowing there, but nothing of any concern. About that time, I heard a Rocky Mountain Dash 7 call to the tower that it had a 20-knot loss on climb out, and as I looked out the front of the cockpit window, I could see the Dash 7 was about the midfield point where we'd spotted the dirt blowing, and he looked to be about 200 to 300 feet above the ground. I then proceeded to brief the rest of my flight crew that due to the look at the sky conditions and that, we would still be using the 5-degree flap takeoff, that we would use maximum EPR for the takeoff, and then the tower cleared us to follow next aircraft onto the runway. I turned on the color radar and observed and brought to the attention of the rest of the crew that we had a very strong cell with a red center, approximately 35 miles northeast of the airport. But since everything was moving from west to east, that it would not be a factor. We'd be turning to the northwest away from it anyway. At that point, we were lined up on the runway, and tower clears for takeoff. Said your north field wind is 270. It figures about approximately 8 knots. Your midfield wind is 270 at 20, gusting to something like 28, which correlated with the wind that was blowing across the runway and all that dirt at midfield point. And your south field wind is 260 at approximately 9. So I told the rest of the crew, I said, well, that looks okay. Set takeoff thrust and move the throttles up to the max EPR setting for the takeoff power. So we continue with the normal takeoff, and about the point where we've been observing the blowing dirt and where we thought the 20 gust and the 30 knot wind was located, the co-pilot called out. He says, got an airspeed hesitation here at 120 knots. And I looked down, and as soon as I looked down, the airspeed was starting to, he says, oh, disregard it. He says, the airspeed's accelerating again. We continue with a normal takeoff roll and acceleration into VR. I started bringing the aircraft nose up, and I had about 9 to 10 degrees of body angle. When we just about reached V2, co-pilot called my attention again. He says, the airspeed's starting to decay. I glanced down to see the airspeed starting to move back towards VR. I reached over and I called for firewall power, and the co-pilot followed up on my push, and we had the throttles maximum forward. At that time, the flight engineer called out, you've lost 20 knots. I looked down and observed the airspeed had actually decreased 20 knots from our V2 speed, and we're now starting back, it was about 10 knots below what our VR speed had been. I checked the rotation at about the 9-degree point we had, and I realized that we were committed and had to try and get the airplane off the ground, and I continued with the rotation, noting that the V speed was still about, we're about 2 to 4 knots below VR speed, but continue with the rotation at about the point when we had an 18-degree body angle or so. All of a sudden, the airspeed shot up at the same time that the airplane suddenly left the ground. My engineer was calling out our good body attitude, and airspeed was increasing, and at that point we had a normal climb out, except very bumpy and rocky. As we're about 9,500 feet, my engineer called out that he was having a problem to pressurize the aircraft. So then I advised the co-pilot, tell ATC that we cannot pressurize the aircraft. We'd like to return to Denver, and that we would be not requiring any assistance because it was just a pressurization problem. We then went ahead and had a normal approach and landing in Denver, and then taxied into the gate, shut the aircraft down, and went through the shutdown procedure. And about that time, I noticed quite a few of the ramp people coming out and scurrying over to look at towards the back of the aircraft. My co-pilot asked, would it be okay if he went back there to see what everybody was going back to look at? And I said, yeah, go ahead. And I said, I'll help the engineer write up the problem with the pressurization. But shortly after that, my co-pilot came back and he said, I think we found the pressurization problem. And I said, oh, how come so fast? He says, well, it seems we got a piece of red and white antenna sticking in the belly of the airplane.
The antenna referred to by Captain Gore was located nearly 1,200 feet beyond the end of the runway and was broken off only 13 feet above the ground. Dramatic proof of the potentially devastating consequences of a microburst encounter. Like Captain Gore's experience, many times the warning signs may not be absolute, so be alert to the sum total of all indicators. On takeoff or landing, if you do suspect wind shear, consider your runway selection or a short delay until conditions are more favorable. If you do make a go decision, either to take off or land, consider the options available to increase the performance of your airplane, such as your flap setting and your speed margin. If you do find yourself in a severe low-altitude wind shear during takeoff or landing, anticipate increased performance as you enter the headwind portion of the shear, followed by suddenly decreasing performance as you transition into the downdraft and tailwind segments of the shear. In this situation, you must respond quickly and correctly to avoid an accident. Increased thrust may be required all the way to full forward throttles, and trading speed for altitude by increasing your pitch attitude as necessary up to stick shaker speed may allow you to maintain or establish a positive flight path. Now, let's sum things up. The relative rarity of severe low-level wind shear encounters may in effect increase their potential as a hazard. Be prepared when you're operating in areas where the potential for wind shear exists. Be alert not only to low-level wind shear alerts from ATC, but also to PIREPs from other flights. And remember, you are an important part of this information process. If you suspect wind shear, report it. Although your encounter may have been minor, the changing nature of the phenomenon could make that encounter critical for a subsequent flight. Review your operating procedures on a regular basis and know the performance limits of your aircraft. So if you find yourself in an emergency situation, you can respond promptly and correctly. Remember, there have been documented cases of wind shear which no aircraft has the capability to successfully traverse.
Here's a quick check of your sea ice edge, and what you're noticing here with all the white is the higher concentration ice above 80%. This is coming in on a west and northwesterly wind. It's probably going to be stuck very close to Barrow for at least the next several days there. A lot of this ice pack is still on the move, and again moving from west to east. The light blue color is anywhere from 20 to 80% in concentration, and then our open water is as close as Wainwright, and that's about as good as it gets right now. Your latest weather information for ice, weather.gov/Anchorage/ice, again from the Anchorage National Weather Service and the Alaska Sea Ice Program. For southeastern Alaska, south and easterly winds will be moving up the inner channels anywhere from 10 to 20 knots. 3 to 4 foot seas on the inside, and out across the outer coast, 20-knot winds from the south and southeast, pretty much parallel to the coast with 5-foot seas in all locations for Wednesday. By Thursday, winds diminish a little bit up north to about 15 knots, 15 to 20 south of Cross Sound and all the way down to the Dixon entrance, again with 4 to 5-foot seas. On the inside, 10 to 15 knots with 2 to 3-foot seas expected there as we get into Thursday. And again, rain is on the way. For south central, a southerly flow up Cook Inlet, 10 to 15 knots with 2 to 3-foot seas. Westerlies coming across the Barrens, becoming northwesterly as they bend out into the western Gulf, 15 to 30 knots in those regions. 20 knots coming across Shelikof from the west, and a 5-foot sea on the inside. 8-foot seas east of Kodiak Island, and a light northeasterly flow inside of Prince William Sound with a 2-foot sea on Wednesday. For Thursday, winds remain light on the inside of the Sound, a south and easterly flow on the outside up to 15 knots with a 4-foot sea. Look for 20 to 25 coming across the Barrens from the west with a 5 to 6-foot sea there. Southwesterlies increase up Cook Inlet and become southerly as they get into the northern half of the inlet north of Calican Island. 3 to 5-foot seas are expected there, and southwesterlies remain light east of Kodiak Island with a 10-knot wind. Across Alaska Peninsula and inside of Bristol Bay, a 20-knot wind with a 3-foot sea. Southwesterlies south of Sand Point to King Cove, 25 knots with a 7-foot sea there, 6-foot seas along the Bering Sea coast. As we get into Thursday, more of a uniform westerly flow, all around 20 knots or so, 6 to 7-foot seas on either side of the peninsula. As you get out a little bit further from Sand Point and westward, seas come up as high as 8 to 9 feet there on Thursday. Across the Aleutians, a west and southwesterly flow will continue for most of the day. A stronger westerly wind as you get out toward Kiska and Attu with a 30-knot flow with 11-foot seas, 12 to 15-foot seas across the Pacific coast of the central and eastern chain, and 9 to 12-foot seas as you go from Unalaska to Nikolsky on that west and southerly flow. As we get into Thursday, a little bit more of a southerly wind develops north of the central and eastern chain with 5 to 7-foot seas there. Winds become a little more variable around Adak and Atka and the Bering Sea coast, still holding on to stronger winds on the Pacific side up to 30 knots, and westerly winds develop in the western chain, 7-foot seas on a 15 to 20 knot wind from the west. Across the west coast, southwesterlies around St. Lawrence Island, southerlies coming up the YK Delta, a 6-foot sea there and 20-knot winds, and southerlies across the Pribilofs, 25 knots with a 10-foot sea. For Thursday, look for more of a south and westerly wind. Remember, as low pressure is moving in, it's going to pull those winds in from the south and west, so a frontal boundary will be working in toward land behind that. Again, low pressure is still moving that wind from the south and west at about 20 to 25, and seas as high as 10 feet around St. Matthew Island waters. Now across the northwest slope, easterlies moving offshore from Wainwright all the way down to Kotzebue Sound, 15 to 25 knots with 3 to 5-foot seas. A northwesterly flow over the ice around Point Barrow all the way out toward Prudhoe Bay, and seas come up to 5 feet across the eastern Beaufort with a 20-knot wind. As we get into Thursday, winds will diminish up north, but notice they're still pushing toward land, so that means any ice will also be moving in that general direction. An offshore flow from Wainwright down to Cape Lisburne, more of a northeasterly flow there. Both areas in the Chukchi coming up to 20 knots with a 6-foot sea. A quick recap of tonight's weather. Cold air is still locked up north, and snow and a winter storm warning is in effect for the eastern Brooks Range above 3,500 feet east of the Dalton Highway. Could come down with 4 to 8 inches of snow by noon tomorrow before that ends. Wet weather is moving in from the west. That will increase rain chances across southwestern Alaska, and a disturbance across the eastern Gulf will bring rain into southeastern Alaska as we head into Wednesday and Thursday. Look for rain to move across southwest into south central Alaska by Thursday afternoon, bringing more rain to more places in the Susitna, the Matanuska, and the Anchorage region, as well as the Copper River Basin and the interior. Thanks for watching Alaska Weather. We'll see you again tomorrow.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
From her rich and fertile valleys to the shores of her icy seas, from her fields and farms and shellfish beds and her many nurseries, for the finest of her flavor, for the freshest by far, choose the things Alaskans bring to the market where you are. Products that we're proud to call our own, and it's all Alaska grown.